Ted Bundy has gone down in history as one of the most iconic serial killers to ever live, having slain more than 30 women at an alarming rate during a 4-year period. He epitomized narcissism and pure evil, and he didn't even try to deny it. According to Ted Bundy himself, he was the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Fortunately, we can say that justice was served as Ted Bundy had the worst time in prison. His fellow prisoners did terrible things to him until his last day in 1989. Welcome back to another episode of Human Wreckage True Crime Podcast. This episode I wanted to do a quick cover of Ted Bundy. I could babble on for hours about this serial killer, but wanted to just do a quick overview of him. Let's get into it. Here's the story of Ted Bundy's reign of terror, his multiple escapes from authorities, and his final moments. Ted Bundy's upbringing was particularly unorthodox. His grandparents raised him as their own son, and he grew to think of his mother as his sister. Unfortunately for Ted, his grandparents weren't the gentle and loving sort. Instead, they beat him and his mother, Elena, on a regular basis. One day, Elena ran away with Ted to family members in Tacoma, Washington. She married Johnny Bundy, who adopted Ted and gave him his last name. Unfortunately, home life didn't get much better. Ted wasn't the biggest fan of his stepfather. Ted would later paint Johnny in a negative light, claiming that he wasn't very smart and didn't make much money. Despite living life as a loner, Ted was reasonably well liked at school. However, Ted would later reveal dark fantasies scattered throughout his life. For example, he described how he would stalk women in the Erie streets at night. In 1965, Ted graduated from high school and enrolled at the University of Puget Sound. Just as many students changed their tune and decided to study elsewhere, Ted transferred to the University of Washington a year later, planning to study Chinese, but it wasn't for him. In 1968, he briefly dropped out of school and re-enrolled as a psychology major, choosing to spend his free time visiting the East Coast. During this period, he learned that his entire life was a lie, and that the woman that he thought was his sister was actually his mother. As you can imagine, this had a serious impact on his psychology. Ted had a certain charm and level of attraction that caught the eye of several women. While studying at the University of Washington, a divorcee from Utah fell for Ted. Elizabeth Klopfer was working as a campus secretary at the School of Medicine when she started dating the future serial killer. Elizabeth finally spoke out in recent years on her relationship with Bundy, and the police would rely on her report of Ted as a suspect. Another valuable source would be Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer who met Ted while they were both working at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. In fact, Ann would even write one of the biographies of Ted Bundy titled The Stranger Beside Me. How did it all begin? Ted Bundy wasn't only a serial killer, but he was also a serial academic. In 1973, he was accepted into the University of Puget Sound to study law. While he didn't ever graduate, he did attend a few months of classes. Finding himself exactly where he wanted to be, Ted Bundy started his criminal career in January 1974. His first known attack was not a murder, but rather an assault. After spying on 18-year-old Karen Sparks, who was a student and dancer at the University of Washington, Ted broke into her apartment. Catching Karen unawares, Ted beat her with a metal rod from her bed frame. When she was unconscious, he sexually assaulted her in a horrific manner. Karen's life would never be the same after she woke up from a 10-day coma with permanent disabilities. But Ted had enjoyed a taste for violence, and he wanted more. No one can be certain of each and every one of Ted's unfortunate victims, but the next confirmed attack was on Linda Ann Healy, another University of Washington student. Unfortunately for Linda, she wouldn't live to tell the tale. A month after attacking Karen Sparks, Ted used the same tactic of breaking into Linda's apartment in the early hours of the morning. Once inside, he knocked her unconscious. Kicking his crime up a notch, he wrapped her body and carried her to the car. Linda was never seen again, at least not alive or in one piece. It took many years until her skull was eventually discovered at one of Ted Bundy's dump sites. Realizing that he could get away with his sordid crimes, Ted continued to attack female students in the bustling college area. As they say, practice makes perfect, and he soon refined the process of luring innocent women into his control. Ted would wear a cast or appear disabled and weakened. Then he would ask the unsuspecting victim to help him put something in his car. Ted developed a modus operandi that involved beating the woman unconscious before tying her up and then raping and killing her. He identified a remote location in the woods to dump the bodies and would regularly visit the location to fool around with the decaying corpses. In more perverted instances, he would keep the skulls of his victims inside his apartments as trophies. For the average person, his actions are not only evil and depraved but unthinkable. Yet Ted had an explanation. Ted didn't shy away from taking responsibility for his crimes. While the very thought of his actions may repulse you, he thrived off of reliving the horrific moments. Ted Bundy would later explain the appeal, saying, "The ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking of a life, and then the physical possession of the remains." According to Ted, the theme of possession was critical to his drive. He continues, "Murder is not just a crime of lust or violence. It becomes possession. They are part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one. And the grounds where you kill them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them." Once he killed his first victim, he kept coming back for more, and a series of murders followed. A single missing college student can be overlooked as an isolated incident. However, Ted Bundy abducted and murdered at least 5 female college students over the course of 5 months. His victims included Donna Gail Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks, Brenda Carroll Ball, and Jorgan Hawkins, all of whom were studying in the Pacific Northwest. The disappearances were put on police radar, and the serious situation prompted a major investigation. The local police force teamed up with different government agencies, including the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, where Ted Bundy was working at the time. Not only did this give him first-hand knowledge of any progress, but it also introduced Ted to Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of 2 children. The pair would later marry and have a child. News of the missing college students spread far and wide, and everyone was on the hunt for the perpetrator. Based on witness statements, police were able to draw up a description of their suspect and his vehicle, and it was eerily similar to Ted Bundy and his car. Eventually, some of the victims' bodies were found in the woods, but as fate would have it, Ted moved to Salt Lake City to study law. Instead of turning over a new leaf, he continued to rape and murder young women. Among his victims was a hitchhiker from Idaho and 4 teenage girls in Utah. Ted Bundy's evil knew no limits. Most people would have missed the fact that the disappearances stopped in Tacoma and picked up again in Utah, but Elizabeth Klopfer knew that Ted had made the move. When she learned about the murders in Utah, she called the police for a second time, reaffirming her suspicions of her former lover. By this point, it was confirmed that Ted Bundy matched the profile, and he was in the correct location. With evidence building up against Ted, police had no option but to move him to the top of their suspect list. But would he stay there? As Ted's body count increased, he became more and more confident as well as sloppy. Ted made a big mistake on the day that he abducted both Janice Ann Ott and Denise Marie Naslund. Instead of sneakily kidnapping the women, his actions were witnessed by bystanders. According to witness statements, an attractive young man wearing a sling abducted the 2 women. The suspect was driving a brown Volkswagen Beetle and told them that his name was Ted. Police released the description, and even more people came forward to identify Ted Bundy as the suspect, including his ex-girlfriend, a close friend, a co-worker, and his former psychology professor. Besides the fact that Ted used his real name, police were still unable to pin him down. Although police were given a very clear picture of Ted Bundy, the description was lost among a mountain of tips. When authorities did come around to assess Ted, they saw a law student who was well put together and had no criminal record as an adult. According to them, Ted didn't fit the profile of their perpetrator. For a while, Ted managed to escape the suspicion of authorities. Without accountability, Ted would take the lives of at least 30 innocent women across 7 states and become one of the most notorious serial killers to ever live. His final lawyer would eventually describe Ted as the very definition of heartless evil. So, how did Ted eventually get caught? Believing that he was smarter than authorities, Ted was oblivious to the suspicion that had been cast on his name. Unheeding, Ted moved across state lines and continued to murder young women. In the meantime, his description was circulating among local authorities, and observant cops were taking note. In August 1975, after 4 years of indulging in a murderous spree, Ted Bundy was pulled over in a Salt Lake City suburb. The cop on duty noticed masks, handcuffs, and blunt objects in his car. Suspicious, but not validated in making an arrest, the police officer put Ted Bundy under surveillance. After suspicious materials were found in Ted's car, authorities felt confident to pursue him as their main suspect. But since the initial description was confirmed, Ted had sold his car. Luckily, police were able to track down his Beetle, where they discovered DNA evidence that matched 3 of the victims. Now the police had what they needed to make a proper case. Ted Bundy was called to the station to appear in a lineup. One of the women that he had attempted to abduct sat behind the glass and pointed to Ted as the perpetrator. Armed with this new evidence, police were able to convict Ted of kidnapping and assault. With Ted behind bars, police did their best to build a murder case against him. Police thought that they had some control over the situation. As long as Ted Bundy was locked up, police thought that the innocent college students were protected from his evil. But this was a dangerous assumption to make. With his limited knowledge and exaggerated ego, Ted decided to represent himself in court, which offered him certain privileges such as pre-court breaks and being unshackled. In 1977, Ted Bundy was on a break in the law library of the courthouse in Aspen, Colorado. While waiting, he jumped from the second-floor window and fled. He managed to disappear into the trees. Free from captivity, Ted Bundy set his sights on escaping toward Aspen Mountain. Once he arrived, he broke into a cabin and a trailer, stealing supplies necessary for survival. However, it was slim pickings, and he was forced to vanish into the wilderness. Stealthily moving back toward Aspen, he stole a car and attempted to open up the distance between himself and his captors. Once again, his cockiness got the better of him, and his reckless driving caught the attention of local police officers. After 6 days on the run, Ted Bundy returned to captivity. You'd think that his first escape would cause officials to tighten security, but it was less than 6 months and Ted Bundy had escaped a second time. Somehow, Ted got his hands on a map of the prison and realized that his jail cell was directly beneath the chief jailer's living space. Only a small crawl space was separating the 2 rooms. Ted traded with others in the prison and managed to get a small hacksaw. While everyone else was showering or exercising, Ted was scraping away the layers of plaster in his ceiling until a tiny crawl space revealed itself. Realizing that he had to lose weight to fit inside, Ted went on an extreme weight loss mission. The final step in his plan was to stow away a pile of money that his future wife, Carol Ann Boone, would smuggle into the prison. Eventually, Ted was thin enough to fit into the tiny small space. Crawling into the chief jailer's room, he was relieved to find it unoccupied and hastily shed his prison jumpsuit before slipping into the jailer's civilian clothes. Happy with his appearance, Ted simply walked out of the jail's front doors undisturbed. Realizing that time was of the essence, Ted immediately stole a car and headed straight for Florida. His plan was to keep a low profile, but life didn't go as expected. For example, his inability to produce identification stopped him from getting a job, so he fell back into a life of crime. While he started with stealing, his malicious behavior quickly escalated yet again. Ted was on the run for 2 weeks, but he couldn't resist the urge to commit more horrific crimes. On January 15, 1978, he broke into a Chi Omega sorority house on the Florida State University campus. Without delay, he sexually assaulted and killed both Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy. Next, he moved on to attack Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, who managed to survive, but not without severe injuries. The entire attack lasted only 15 minutes, but his bloodlust was not satiated. Moving down the road, Ted broke into Cheryl Thomas' apartment and attacked the unsuspecting woman. Despite these horrific crimes, Ted evaded capture and continued to abduct 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach on February 8th. He killed the young girl and hid her body on a pig farm. However, Ted's reign of terror was coming to an end. While Ted was indulging in his morbid crimes, he was still living on the run. Once again, his reckless driving found him in trouble after police realized that the number plates belonged to a stolen car. After pulling Ted to the curb, authorities found the IDs of 3 dead women in his vehicle. Ted Bundy was put under arrest and muttered, "I wish you had killed me," to the arresting officer. While on trial, Ted blatantly ignored the advice of his lawyers and took charge of his own defense. Joseph Alloy, a defense investigator, said, "I would describe him being as close to being like the devil as anyone I ever met." There was no way that Ted would get away this time, and he was eventually convicted and placed on death row at Ryford Prison in Florida. Here he got a taste of his own medicine. Once behind bars, Ted suffered serious abuse from other incarcerated individuals. He was even allegedly gang raped by 4 men. Eventually, the time came for him to face the music, and Ted Bundy took a seat in the electric chair. It was disclosed that he harbored a deep fear of sexual assault and spent the night before his demise in tears and prayers alongside Methodist minister Fred Lawrence. It's estimated that Bundy's extensive prosecution, involving numerous appeals, along with his 10 years on death row, incurred a total cost of approximately $5 million for the state. Women around the United States breathed a sigh of relief on January 24, 1989, as the killer took his final breath. A multitude of celebrants sang, danced, and ignited fireworks in a field opposite the prison during Bundy's execution, including a group of students, who gathered holding banners that read, "Thank God it's Friday." They enthusiastically cheered as the white hearse, carrying Bundy's remains, departed from the prison. He had no proper funerals, and his cremated remains were secretly scattered at an undisclosed site in the Cascade Range of Washington state. Bundy's mother, Louise, passed away at 88, steadfast in her refusal to accept her son's involvement in the murders of numerous women. She lovingly told him, "You'll always be my precious son," just moments before his execution. Ted Bundy left behind a child with Carol Ann Boone, whom he convinced to marry him during his trial. Boone supported him throughout and even gave birth to their child while he was on death row. However, with Bundy's confession, their marriage shattered. Boone moved away to live a private life. She declined Bundy's last call before his execution and passed away in 2018 from septic shock. Their daughter, Rose Bundy, has remained out of public view, most likely with a different name. To this day, Ted Bundy is hated as one of the most terrifying and unnerving serial killers to ever have lived. Before his death, he confessed to many murders, but the true number of victims remains unknown. In the same breath, he denied certain killings, even though physical evidence suggested otherwise. Ted Bundy's name is not a favorable one. With reportedly 100 people killed by his hands, he has lived up to his reputation as the very definition of heartless evil. We can only hope that another killer isn't challenged to improve on Ted Bundy's horrific acts. In the Netflix series Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes, some of the final confessions Bundy recorded during interviews he held before his execution were revealed, where he relentlessly tries to find excuses for his inhumane behavior. Thanks for joining me again. If you like what I do, hit the subscribe button. Till next time, please take care.